I think the continuous work from the government side in terms of creating policy frameworks which are well understood, have an element of predictability, are quite important. On the regulation side, again, the less the surprises, the more the involvement from the private sector. That's extremely important. And therefore, when it comes to regulations that you might find in some sectors are more protected than others, that is also an element of discouragement to the private sector. And then the region today is sort of coming out of a lot of the there's conflict, of course, and then there's the reconstruction after conflict, and many governments are in a hurry to build investments. And so the public sector, in some instances, crowds out the private sector. And so governments have to be mindful about keeping this balance. Yes, there's this need to build companies, build bridges, try and have the quick wins on the ground for the population, but at the same time there needs to be mindfulness that does not crowd out or discourage the private sector from coming in. So I think if I would summarize from the public policy side, transparent frameworks with clear objectives and instruments, trying to keep away from surprises when it comes to the policy sphere, and try and be mindful about how the public sector would not necessarily crowd the private sector. And then finally, when we're talking about countries looking for their comparative advantage, with the youth bulge that is in the Middle East, this whole space which was not there before when it comes to entrepreneurship, innovation, technological, the use of technology in sort of promoting this private sector within the countries, I think that is actually a very good opportunity going forward for investments in the Middle East.
Thank you. Ahmed, I have a follow-up question now from what Rania said for you. I'm curious to know, just from a private investment standpoint, your thoughts on her comments, but specifically when she spoke about certain sectors being more protected, and so that's discouraging to private investors. What do you see as the sectors that are open to investment and that would benefit from it, and where do you see, are there sectors that you think are protected that would benefit from being more open?
I think there are quite a few sectors across all of the Arab countries that are protected for a host of reasons, whether they're sort of sensitive from a sovereign standpoint. A lot of them tend to be in extractive industries, but more often than not, you'll see sectors that shouldn't be protected by a country that are, and it's really to try and protect sort of the vested interests and those essentially seeking rents in these countries. And just to throw this up as a main theme, because for us as an investor in the region, it's been a primary theme for the last few decades. We think the primary issue of why investments haven't sort of flourished and taken off, whether it's through FDI or through portfolio flows, and they haven't been sustained in the Arab countries, has been because these governments have essentially smothered the private sector. They've crowded them out through over-regulation, through big structural distortions. We like, as investors, we like to identify sort of the best and worst of breed by country. And so I'd say, I won't talk about the worst of breed, but the best of breed is most likely Morocco. And if you look at Morocco and sort of...
I did not pay him for that.
If you look at Morocco over the last 15 years, it's done everything right. It's had amazing policy framework and amazing transparency of policy. It's implemented it in a pretty open way. But what they've done is they've completely smothered the private sector, and they've taken sort of another lever of growth out of the equation. So if you look at the distortions they've created on the supply side, there are a lot of headline sort of achievements. The ports, these new dynamic industries that are in the country that are generating some jobs, automotive,
Yes, aeronautics,
offshoring. Morocco will have the first high-speed train in the region. It'll be the number 2 auto producer in the continent. by 2019. I mean, these are fantastic achievements for any country, let alone an Arab country. And yet, the primary way that these achievements have been created is that the government has come in and it's dominated the investment space. So it's gone from 30% of gross capital formation to 50% over the last decade. And in the process, they've essentially crowded out the private sector from the banking system, but from more generally access to resources in the country. And they've also disincentivized local entrepreneurs to sort of start new businesses and get engaged in some of these really dynamic sectors. On the demand side, they've done even worse things. They've essentially ramped up government spending. They've propped up the property market by introducing a lot of sort of distorted incentives for people to get land and build real estate projects. And so if you look at job creation, for instance, over the last 15 years, 1 million jobs have been created. 65-70% of those jobs have been in non-productive sectors like property and retail trade and other. And a consequence of this is exports haven't grown. They've been stymied. And exports is also a result of the fact that the currency has been overvalued and capital controls have essentially created a hothouse effect in the country. But so I mentioned Morocco because Morocco is a positive outlier in the region. And yet what they're doing, this very sort of smothering patriarchal force that they've implemented in the country what it's done is it's taken away a very important lever of growth for the country. And I think the region needs shock therapy in the sense that these governments need to acknowledge the fact that they need to just loosen up a bit, allow market forces to dictate the allocation of capital more. Instead of over-regulating the economy and many of these industries.
Well, I can comment on that one. I agree with you about having all these strategies in place and feeling that there is a crowding out of the private sector from it, but it's not the goal of the government anyway, because today there are more and more, because you were saying about the banking also with the public, it's more public. It's not really, it's very private, right? The banking system in Morocco, right?
It's private, but 3 banks in Morocco control almost 90% of all assets.
It's not a public thing, right? I mean, it's not, they're
one
not government
of those 3 is a government-owned, government-controlled bank.